The Q presents Outside the Box, brought to you by the LCCC Communications Arts Department. On Outside the Box, we debate and discuss the issues that shape the campus community. Now let's meet our host, Layla.
From minimum wage to digital banking, our economic landscape is constantly evolving. And whether you're a seasoned expert or just a student trying to pay bills, jumping into the topic can seem quite daunting. I'm Lalaj Johnson, and on today's episode of Outside the Box, we're going to be breaking down the economy, what we should look out for, and how that exactly applies to you. But before we get into that, let's introduce our guest. With me, as always, is my co-host Bobby Brenner, as well as LCC's Dr. Gary Mrozinski. Thank you all for coming to the show. Dr. Mrozinski, you're chair of the business department here at the school, so what does that entail?
Well, thank you, Lalaj and Bobby, for inviting me here today. This is going to be a lot of fun. Yes, I'm chair of the Business and Computer Information Systems Department, and what I do in that role is work with our faculty and our Vice President of Academic Affairs to put together a schedule of classes each semester to offer. We offer them here at main campus. During the day and the evenings, we have online courses, and we teach at off-campus sites. And then finding the right faculty for each of those course sections that we offer. So that's a big part of the job, especially in the early part of before the semester starts and in the early part of the semester. The business programs we have are business administration, accounting, healthcare management, and paralegal services.
Very nice.
Yeah.
So I would like to start talking on this subject about e-commerce. So a lot of today's market seems to be shifting to the internet. Do you think this shift from physical stores to an online presence has any effect on the economy at all?
Well, it has had a huge effect on the economy. We've seen a huge structural change in the way people buy their products. We've seen retail stores, now this is the last 10 to 20 years, retail stores closing down. I'll tell you what, I was just watching for the first time Stranger Things. I don't know if you're a fan of that show, but it takes place in the 80s. That's when I was a young person.
Yes.
And it shows them for fun going to the mall, which is what people like us used to do. And the mall was filled with all kinds of retail stores and restaurants and entertainment and arcades. We don't have that anymore.
We don't.
People buy their products online, or a large percentage of them. They just like the ease with which they can do that.
Right.
And so it's changed the way our products go from the producer to the consumer. Now there's a different distribution channel. So retail stores have declined. I don't think we're ever going to go back and see as many retail stores as we once had.
Right.
So yes, it's a permanent change to our economy.
And it seems like a lot of businesses now, instead of even thinking about opening up a physical location, it's can I open up an Etsy shop or an online store? So it does seem like moving forward, it will be less places to actually shop and more places online to shop. I do think that presents some challenges, however, for people who do kind of rely on being able to go to these places. There are people that are older, that are used to shopping, so what does that mean for them?
I agree with you, and there are some products that I feel very uncomfortable buying online, like shoes.
Absolutely.
I feel like I really need to try the shoes on and walk in them before I buy them. I hope we never get to the point where I don't have a place to go and shop for shoes.
Absolutely.
So I think there will always be a minimum amount of retail outlets available for people.
Oh, that's good
It's
to
just
know.
that I think it's been a permanent shift, and I don't see, unless something changes about what our population wants, what our consumers want, I don't see us going back to more retail stores.
Right.
Yeah.
Especially since, buying stuff online is significantly easier than actually going to the store or several stores to find what you want, when I can just pull up like Amazon and just find everything I
Right.
need, get it within the next few days.
It's also less costly because what's being cut out of the process, the traditional supply chain would be someone manufactures the shoe. It then gets sold to a wholesaler whose job is to, transportation and logistics and warehousing, get it to distribute it over a wide geographic area and get it to the retail stores, sell to the retail stores. The retail store buys from the wholesaler, resells it to the consumer, And they've got their costs. Their costs are their retail staff that are working in their store, whatever it costs to operate their store. So there's steps of that process that are being cut out. So that should lower the cost, and it does.
Right.
So overall, it's lowering the cost of the product
Right.
for the consumer. But as you said, you can't sell everything that way. People are still going to want retail stores.
Absolutely.
And I think we'll always have sort of a minimum, and maybe we're now at that minimum. The percentage of products we currently are buying in retail stores versus online.
Right.
This might be sort of the new sort of standard. I don't know if we're going to go any fewer retail stores. as a
Speaking of
percentage.
things like Amazon and distribution centers, do you think that part is still going to be something? Because that is jobs for people. I do know Amazon has a giant warehouse where people do distribute and deliver the product to the people. So do you think we have to worry about that type of market going away as far as jobs?
No, I don't think so. It would be nice if there were a large competitor to Amazon to compete with Amazon, because
Right.
they have, one of the smart things that Amazon did as a business is they were not profitable for a very long time because they were taking their profits. So if you were a shareholder, you were not getting dividends and profit distributions. That's because they were taking all of their profits and plowing it back into the company and
Right.
building out this very expensive network of warehouses and transportation networks, which is now what they have.
Right.
So it's very difficult for another e-commerce competitor to compete with that.
Right.
Because it's just so expensive and takes so long to do.
Right.
But it would be good if there were more competitors.
Yeah, I think Walmart is trying to become one.
Yep.
So we'll
You're
see
right.
where
They're
that
probably
goes.
the number 2
Yes.
e-commerce provider.
So I would like to ask you now, what do you think are the long-term effects of online trade, especially now that it's a large-scale bartering and non-traditional type of currency thing?
I'm sorry, was that cryptocurrency?
I believe we're,
Did
yes.
you jump into?
I think we already kind of answered that, so yeah.
So we can move
yeah.
on to cryptocurrency? Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't understand your question.
So just the long-term effects of online trade, we already talked about that. So now the next question would be cryptocurrency. Is this more stable than physical money? Is this a reliable source of income, do you think?
Cryptocurrency, we should probably first talk about what it is. It's a
Yes.
form of digital money, so it's electronic. And you might say, well, we already have electronic money, and that's true. We have the money supply in the United States is 90% electronic.
Yes, online banking.
90% of it is in banks, right. Only about 10% of it is actual physical currency that people carry in their wallets and hide under their mattresses or whatever they do with it.
Very true.
So 90% of the money is in banks, and you can see an electronic statement. You can transfer money electronically. You can pay your bills electronically. You
Yes.
probably are being paid electronically.
Yep, direct
So
deposit.
it's right now it's 90% digital anyway. But the difference between a cryptocurrency and the U.S. dollar is the U.S. dollar is controlled by a central bank,
Right.
our Federal Reserve. Cryptocurrency doesn't have a central bank. It's a distributed network.
Right.
So that raises the question, is that better than a currency that's controlled
absolutely.
by your central bank? Well, if you don't have a currency, if a nation were using only cryptocurrency, then one of the implications of that would be that their central bank, the government, central bank's part of the government, would not have monetary policy as an economic tool to help the economy when it's needed.
Right.
And that's what our Federal Reserve is doing right now. We have very high inflation recently, which has been a rare thing in our history recently anyway, the last 40 years.
Right.
They've used monetary policy, our Federal Reserve, our central bank, adjusting the size of the money supply, which influences interest rates, which slows down spending, which brings the inflation rate down.
Right.
You would not have that tool available to you if you had only cryptocurrency.
Correct.
So, and you had a question about whether it's more stable.
Right. Long term.
So far, it has not been. It's been as an investment. So if you trade in your dollars for Bitcoin, then you're hoping that the transfer rate, the exchange rate, is going to improve, and then when you cash in your Bitcoin for dollars or some other currency, you would get more for it than you put in. That's what the hope is.
Right.
But so far, the cryptocurrencies have been volatile, and it's been more of a speculative way to invest your money.
Right.
But it's been proven that the system could work. So it does
Okay.
show promise.
Does show
and there are some
promise.
advantages to it.
Alrighty. So you're saying that it is something that is showing promise. Do you think in the next 10 or 20 years or so it could be something that we
think
could
it's-
begin to rely on?
I think it's going to grow, and it's going to grow in use. And there's probably going to be, I did look up the largest cryptocurrencies, and in order, at least right now, Bitcoin, Ethereum, Binance Coin, Cardano, and Dogecoin are the largest so far. I think what we're going to see is a few of them get larger and some of the smaller ones sort of fade away.
Right.
Because what gives it stability, any currency, even a traditional currency that's controlled by the central bank, what gives it stability, one of the things is people's confidence in it.
Right.
So if you're not confident in, if a certain cryptocurrency has a history of volatility, then people are not going to be confident in it and not want to use it.
Absolutely.
But if a few of them, like Bitcoin, get larger and become more stable, I think people will be more comfortable with them. So yes, I think it's going to grow in usage.
Do you think it will ever replace what we have now as far as the banks and the currencies?
Again, I don't think so, because there is an advantage to a central bank controlling a currency. And as I said, it gives them the ability to use monetary policy to adjust interest rates to help the economy when there's either a recession or high inflation.
So
And right
we're
now-
always going to need the banks, basically, more or less.
I think, yeah, I think so.
So backtracking a little bit, we talked about how e-commerce kind of moved from physical locations to mostly online presence. We see the same thing happening with banks and with, like you mentioned briefly, how a lot of our money is not actually like physical; it's mostly electronic. Where do you see that kind of going? Do you see like in the future we might go completely digital, or?
That's a good question. I hadn't thought about is it possible for us to actually go without paper money and coins.
Still back to
I
the
think
banks,
we
though.
can, I think we can get close. And as I said, right now, only 10% of our money supply is paper money and coins. But I think it's possible, because I personally, and I'm an older person, younger people are even more comfortable, I think, with electronic money and electronic transactions. I carry a wallet, but I really only have a couple large bills in there in case I ever need them.
Right.
And I think I pay for even the smallest purchases. If the merchant will accept a credit card, then I'll use a credit card. And then I just intensely monitor my credit card account. And I'm looking at it once a week at least. And ideally you would be paying it off at the end of the month and not paying the finance charges, and really just using it for convenience.
And credit building for younger people too. I think that's also the appeal.
Right.
Just swipe, make sure that you pay it off. You can buy whatever you need. Just make sure that you stay in the green and you build credit in the meanwhile. So
Right.
I can see a world where we don't have physical money, and I'm thinking possibly for the environment that would be a good thing too, for the trees and things of that nature.
Okay. You know what's surprising is we're still building bank branch offices.
We
You would think
are.
there'd be fewer of them. They'd be going away
There was a
completely.
new one in the square. Chase Bank just opened.
And I'll be honest with you, on my way over here, I was in a branch office, check cashing. I'm still getting paper checks in some cases.
Right.
Not a lot of them. My pay doesn't come that way, but there's infrequently, and I have to go and deposit it. I still do take some cash out occasionally. But yeah, there still is the demand for these branch offices, apparently.
Yeah, their jobs as well. So I'm happy when I see a new bank opening, because I'm thinking, a place for people to be employed, make decent money. It's a little better than retail,
A lot of
Gets
our
you into
graduates
accounting.
of our programs end up in the banking
Yes.
industry.
So it's a positive thing, but it would be interesting to see a world with no actual currency. We might be closer to that than we think. Well, it's been very informative, this topic of cryptocurrency, and we will cut to a short break and be back very soon. are back on Outside the Box with Dr. Gary Mrozinski and co-host Bobby Brenner. We've been talking about e-commerce and cryptocurrency and what the future looks like as far as physical money in our economy. Now we will segue into a new topic which we are all very interested in, minimum wage and what that means for Pennsylvania. So, Mr. Mrozinski, in the topic of minimum wage, do you think business owners should be expected to just accept the new wage as it will come, whichever price that may be?
Well, they won't have a choice. If the law passes, they'll have to find a way to comply with it. The question is, what will the new minimum wage be? If there is one, if there is a change. The current federal minimum wage is $7.25.
Yes.
And that is irrelevant right now in our current economy because it is not a binding constraint.
Right.
If an employer were to try to hire someone at $7.25, they wouldn't find any workers.
I know.
So the reason for a minimum wage, the concept of a minimum wage, is that the labor market wage for unskilled labor is too low for someone to be able to support themselves.
Right.
That's not the case right now if the wage is $7.25 because that's below what the market wage is. Normally the minimum wage will be something higher than what the market is dictating. Right now the market is dictating something higher. Most jobs you can get at least $10 an hour. And Pennsylvania does not have a state minimum wage law, but we're surrounded by states that do.
Okay.
Ohio is, I believe, $10 and something per hour. New York is $14 and something per hour. New Jersey, same thing. New Jersey, Massachusetts, Connecticut, all $13 to $14 an hour. So the federal minimum wage that's being proposed is $15 an hour. It's not too different from what the states are already dictating. But that's, again, pretty close to, I think, what the market is dictating as the market wage for unskilled labor. One thing that the unemployment rate, if we're going to get into the concept of unemployment, I'll do it right now if we're not, because
Absolutely.
This is related to the minimum wage. The unemployment rate is very low right now.
Yes.
It's 3.5% nationally, and I have some local numbers for you too. June and July it was 3.5%. In Pennsylvania it was 3.8%, and that was in June, and this is June 2023. In northeastern Pennsylvania, 4.4%. That's always the way it is. There's an unemployment rate for the nation. Pennsylvania is a little bit higher than the nation. Northeastern Pennsylvania is a little bit higher than Pennsylvania. It's just always been that way.
Very interesting.
But even 4.4% is very low.
Yes.
Economists consider 4% unemployment rate to be the goal. They call that full employment.
Mm-hmm.
So if you get to the point where you're under 4%, you're doing really well. Again, as a nation, we're at 3.5%. So what that should be doing is bringing up wages, especially at the bottom end, the lower income jobs in our labor market. Mm-hmm. And that has actually happened.
Right.
And even here locally, you guys know, you have friends, I'm sure, that maybe rather than choosing to come to college have gone right into full-time into the workforce here
Yes.
locally. And you can get a job making $16, $18, $20 an hour
You can.
in warehousing and logistics.
Absolutely.
So
Even up to 20 for some places.
And that has forced, for example, the banking industry locally, that has forced them to bring up the wages that they're paying their entry-level people. We had a local bank come to us, the business department, recently, and who wanted to talk to our business students because they're looking for workers, and they were paying $14 an hour for entry level.
Very nice.
That is lower, though, than other types of jobs that students or anybody that age can qualify for coming right out of high school.
Absolutely.
So it has forced everybody to bring up the wages at the lower end of the labor market.
Absolutely.
To the point that, as I said, a minimum wage of $7.25 then is irrelevant. It's not really holding anybody to anything. Mm-hmm. So the market wage is somewhere between $10 and $12 an hour, maybe, like the lowest. You should be able to find a job for $10 to $12 an hour. Mm-hmm. My son was just hired making $12.50 at a sub shop. So, yeah, if the minimum wage were to be raised, really would have to be something like $15 an hour to have any effect on the economy.
Absolutely. Do you think that would be a good thing for our state to have a $15 minimum wage? Would it improve things?
I think so. Now, employers that hire minimum wage workers, of course, are against this because then they lose any flexibility to offer anything lower than that. And what they would say, the argument against it would be that, well, now we could afford to hire fewer workers. There's going to be more unemployed workers in that segment of the labor market. But I don't think we're anywhere close to that with an unemployment rate as low as it is at 3.5%. So I think the labor market can tolerate an increase in the minimum wage
And that's
to
very good
$15
news.
an hour.
Now, you kind of already answered my question before I asked it, but like you said, there are a lot of businesses that pay a minimum wage that are very much against raising it, just out of fear of what it might do to the economy and to their business. Do you think that this is something that the either the state or the country should, are there things that they should implement to kind of help that ease into paying a minimum wage, or do you think that that's something that the market itself kind of could figure out?
Yes, I see what you're getting at here. So employers that pay mostly minimum wage type workers, what if they're very small?
Yeah.
Yes.
And this could maybe jeopardize their businesses. Maybe some sort of program for very small businesses, and I'd have to give some thought to how that would work, some sort of subsidy or some sort of something to assist them. But any medium-sized company or larger, I think, would not have a problem dealing with an increase in the minimum wage. Because like I said, right now, for all intents and purposes, there is no federal minimum wage that's any kind of a binding constraint on them.
Yeah.
Right. It could be anything.
Yeah.
Hopefully it is the 15. I think that'll be very helpful for a lot of people. I do remember working for $7.25 before the pandemic, and even then it wasn't very sustainable. I was living with my parents at the time, so it was okay, but for anyone who's on their own, have children, it's just not sustainable to make that type of money. A lot of single mothers are the sole breadwinners of their households, and I think we should also keep them in mind when talking about the minimum wage. Who is working and who needs the jobs? People that have a lot of financial responsibility has to be taken into consideration.
Let me just add to that. You're making a great point. The minimum wage, even if it were $15 an hour, that's not a family-sustaining wage.
Yes.
Maybe someone can get somewhere in supporting themselves, but as far as family-sustaining wage, you would need several income earners in the household making a minimum wage, and or one person working more than one job, and even that would be difficult at $15 an hour.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
In the past 2 years, there's been a lot of talk about a recession. There will be a recession coming soon, or we're already in one. What are your thoughts about this?
Yes, actually we're in a period right now of high inflation. There are opposite problems you could have in an economy typically. You could have a recession, so that's at this end of the spectrum. That's where businesses are producing less than they produced last year because maybe people are buying less, so consumer demand is down. If people are buying less, then businesses are producing less, and they don't need as many workers, so they lay off workers and unemployment goes up.
Okay.
So that's one end of the spectrum, high unemployment. That is a recession. The other end of the spectrum, and this happens when the unemployment rate is low typically, is if it gets too low, in other words, too far below 4%, economists speak of the inflationary flashpoint. It could cause high inflation. Currently, we are not even close to a recession. We have the other problem. We have high inflation.
Yes.
Now, inflation has actually improved. By that I mean it has come down in the past year. 1 year ago, it was 9%, and that's very high.
Yes.
We're used to, for a period of the last 40 years, of having a small amount of moderate inflation, 2 to 3% inflation. So inflation is when the overall level of prices goes up. And there's ways that we measure that every month, the level of prices. So if the unemployment rate gets too low and there's any kind of an increase in the demand for goods and services, which did happen after we recovered from the pandemic, there was this pent-up demand for goods and services.
Yes.
During the pandemic, people were actually saving money, paying down their credit cards, and getting the stimulus payments, and the government probably didn't predict that they were going to save as much of their stimulus payments as they did. And they weren't spending, they weren't going on vacations, they were not spending on entertainment, they weren't going to restaurants. Well, as we recovered from the pandemic and these industries started opening up again, there was this pent-up demand for those kinds of things, and even other goods and services. Supply couldn't keep up with demand.
Okay.
And then the unemployment rate was, like I said, if it's at 4% or lower, the only way for businesses to create more supply to meet the demand is to hire more workers. But if you're at 3% unemployment rate, everybody's already working.
Right.
So there's no workers to find. So this makes prices go up. That's where the high inflation came from. It was that, the fact that, as I said, the employment rate was so low. It's always more than one thing. It was that combined with supply chain problems, which we've all heard about and we know about coming out of the pandemic. It was difficult for producers to produce more. It's difficult for the automotive industry to produce cars if they're waiting for microprocessor chips from China, and China's having a hard time producing because they've had a surge in the pandemic.
Right.
So these kinds of supply chain issues made it difficult also for producers and sellers to provide more to the market. This makes the prices go up, causes high inflation. So our central bank, the Federal Reserve, one of the ways they can slow down spending, this is the way you help high inflation. You slow down spending in the economy some. Because we have the US dollar controlled by our central bank, like other major economies, the Federal Reserve shrinks the money supply slightly. That makes interest rates go up, and then that slows down spending in certain markets for things that we buy with borrowed money.
Okay.
So we buy real estate, we buy houses with borrowed money, we buy automobiles. Businesses buy capital goods, they buy equipment, they expand. Usually that's with borrowed money. And then people that work in those industries have less income to spend, and they do less spending in all of the other markets in our economy. So that slows down spending when interest rates go up. Mm-hmm. When that happens, however, if spending is slowed down, usually that makes the unemployment rate rise.
Yes.
So this is the problem. You have a trade-off between high inflation. When inflation goes up, it's because this is the unemployment rate, and if this is inflation, if the unemployment rate goes down, it makes high inflation go up. If you do something to make high inflation come down, it usually makes the unemployment rate go up,
Right.
which sends you towards recession, which I think is the source of your question.
Right.
Yeah.
Is it true that we're headed towards a recession because rising interest rates designed to rein in inflation, which it has done? Inflation is back to 3% now, 3.2% last month. That's normal. It's back to normal. The question is that going to send us into a recession? Most economists think that we are headed for what's called a soft landing, meaning no, the unemployment rate is still at 3.5%. It hasn't risen even above 4% yet.
Right.
So it does not look like we're anytime in the near future, in the next year or two, going to have a recession.
That's good
It would
to
be now the 9% inflation we had a year ago. If we're at 3% now, well, we still had that 9% increase. That didn't go away. That increase is permanent, and now we're 3% above that.
Right.
But still, the inflation rate is back to what we consider to be sort of a normal inflation rate, and that's a good thing. So it looks like things are going well. It does not appear that we're close to having a recession.
That's very good news. I know there's a lot of back and forth about it. A lot of people are saying the economy is doing terrible, some think it's doing great. So that information kind of just puts the facts out there. Like, it's not as bad as it seems. Between the two, which would be the worst for the economy, high inflation or high unemployment, if we had to choose one of the lesser evils?
Boy, that's a difficult question because and yeah, as you were saying, some people think the economy is not doing well now. Even now, there are people not doing well. I'm giving you like the overall
Yeah.
economy, but yes, you're right. Even now, people are struggling. If the unemployment rate is low, but food costs 9% more than it costed last year, that affects some people more than it affects others.
Right.
Who does it affect more?
The lower-
People in the lower income,
lower
who
income,
spend
yeah.
more of their income on necessities, which now are 9% more.
Yes.
And wages did not keep up with, we didn't get 9% pay raises that year.
Right.
Wages did come up, but they say by 5% that year, but you're still 4% behind. So
Absolutely.
it affects lower income and lower middle income more than it affects middle income and upper income, who spend a smaller amount of their income on things like food. So somewhere in the middle is the best.
Of course.
But if you're in the middle, and let's say the unemployment rate is 4% and the inflation rate is 3%, if you're one of those 4% that doesn't have a job, it's not helping you. So you're suffering too. So there's always someone that's suffering in the economy. But you've got to try to be somewhere in between.
Right.
And that's what we try to use our economic policy to do.
Are you familiar with the term shrinkflation?
Yes.
Can you explain it for us?
Yes, shrinkflation is when a manufacturer's costs are going up, or even any kind of service provider. If your costs are going up, but you don't want to raise the price of your product, what you can do is, to deal with the rising cost, don't raise your price, but you give your customer a smaller amount.
Yes, we're seeing this in the stores everywhere now.
Right, yep. So I'm just going to throw General Mills out there, and this is just a random example. General Mills makes cereal. Maybe one way to deal with rising grain costs is still sell cereal in the same size box, but give them fewer ounces and don't raise the price. I teach marketing, and I have this great example of, you know what a half-gallon carton of milk looks like, right?
Yes.
64 ounces. If you were to see that carton, you would assume there's 64 ounces in there. Well, this is an example of an orange juice manufacturer who sold orange juice, didn't want to raise the price of their half-gallon of orange juice. But if you zoom in at the bottom where it shows how much is in there, it says 59 fluid ounces. That to me is deceptive.
It
But that's an
is.
example of shrinkflation.
And most people aren't reading the labels, most people aren't paying attention unless it's glaringly obvious. Like, I remember shopping at Dollar Tree a couple of years ago. You would get the full dozen for $1. Now you get 6 eggs for $1.25. I think that's a form of it. So obviously that's blatant. But in some other ways, just like the bars of candy, just got smaller and smaller every time I bought it. And unless you were really paying attention, you didn't really know. Do you think shrinkflation has an obligation to also be kind of transparent?
I think so, especially the example of the half-gallon milk carton. You know, that to me is deceptive, because the
Absolutely.
expectation is that you're getting a half a gallon, and you've got to read the small print to see how much you wouldn't even think of looking. So whether, deceptive marketing practices, I guess there could be some way to regulate that. But I think there should be backlash on the part of people, should be looking out for that kind of thing.
Right.
And don't shop at that store anymore.
Exactly.
Or don't buy that brand anymore if you've
Dollar Tree would
experienced it
probably
one
go out
time.
of business if that was the case. But yeah, we do have to keep these companies accountable. A lot of the times, if they can get away with it, they will. Do you think shrinkflation is helpful at all? I mean, it's obviously a ploy to kind of deal with inflation. Is it a good tactic?
Yeah, it's inflation for the consumer. It's a way for the manufacturer, the seller, to deal with rising costs. So no, I don't think there's anything good about it. It's also a very short-term benefit to the seller, because the consumer's eventually going to figure it out.
Right.
So no, I don't think there's anything positive about it.
So what could we do about it? How could we fix it?
Like I said, I think if you, and I won't tell you what the brand of orange juice was, but if I stopped buying that brand of orange juice, that's what I would do. In fact, I think I probably did after seeing this example
Public
in my marketing
responsibility.
textbook. Yeah, boycott that company, and and buy from someone that's not using deceptive practices like that.
How many companies are left, do you think, that still practice transparency? Because this seems to be a rising issue.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it depends on what you buy and where you spend your money, and That's a good question. I don't really know.
I guess we'll find out soon enough. So our last topic is saving money. And this is a topic I think is particularly of interest to students, especially in the business department. What advice do you have for students that are starting to think about these things?
Your best opportunity to begin saving money long term is when you get your first full-time job. Right now, if you're a college student, you might be working part-time while you're a full-time student, and you're probably spending all your money to pay for your education bill and to
Yes.
support yourself. It's difficult to think about saving money long-term when you're in this situation. But you're going to graduate, and you're going to get your first full-time job. So employers offer two basic types of retirement plans, and you should get to understand them so that you're ready when you get one of these jobs and get your first retirement benefit. So the benefits that an employer provides, the most important ones are health care coverage, which they pay the lion's share of. You pay some of it, they pay the rest of it, and then retirement. Everybody knows about health care coverage because you need it right now.
Right.
And so you ask questions about that. How much am I going to have to pay in each month? But people don't think about asking questions about the retirement plan that the employer is offering. So there's two basic types. There's defined benefit and defined contribution. So a defined benefit plan, these are not as popular anymore. They're declining in popularity. This is what's known as a pension plan. So when you work for an employer, depending on how many years you worked for this employer, you retire at a certain salary. You get some percentage of that salary each year in retirement based on the number of years you were there.
Right.
So maybe it's something like 2.5% of your salary per year of service. So let's say you work somewhere 30 years and then you retire. So 2.5 times 30 is 75. So you would get 75% of your ending salary each year in retirement. But if you don't work for an employer long term, like for 30 years,
Right.
that's not the kind of plan that would benefit you. You might work somewhere for 10 years, another place for 10 years, another place for 10 years.
Yes.
So you have three different smaller pensions. One of them is based on your salary in the beginning of your career. So
Especially for young people, it's kind
Right.
of the trend to not really stay anywhere long,
Right.
5 years
Everybody.
and then you're gone kind of situation. So
most people will work in 7 different jobs during their
Yes.
career at least. That's like an average. So instead of that, and what you'll probably be offered is a defined contribution plan. What's defined is not what you get at the end, but what is going into it. So your employer will put some percentage of your salary in a long-term investment account. And then you can, sometimes you're required to match some of that, but you could put additional in. The rule of thumb, and this is the most important thing to remember, if you were to go to a financial planner, the financial planner would say, the rule of thumb is to end up with enough money to support yourself at the same standard of living as when you were working, you should be saving 15% of your income into this long-term investment account. It's called a 401k plan. It's a section of the IRS code that is set up for someone who is saving long-term, and the money's actually invested in some mix of stocks and bonds.
Right.
So you're putting small amounts in each year, some percentage of your pay, and then that's growing tax-free. It actually goes into the investment account before any taxes are taken out. It's
Okay.
tax deferred. That's
And
another
so that is
huge
the
advantage.
benefit.
Yep. So here's an example. You might get hired by an employer who their retirement benefit for you is they're going to put, say, 8% of your pay into your 401k plan. If that's the case, you should try to put in an additional 7%, and there's your 15%. And if you have a spouse, then it would be good if your spouse was doing the same thing. So then that will grow over time. You're constantly putting new amounts in, but it's also invested in a kind of mutual fund, which is where some of the money is in stocks, some is in bonds, and long term, that is growing over time. None of this is taxed. It's only taxed once you're retired and you have this big pot of money and you're drawing small amounts out each month. Then it's taxed as income. That's a 401k plan. Again, the thing to remember is 15%. Try to put 15% in. Now, when you're in your 20s, and this was me, I was actually an engineer coming out of college. I had no business courses at that point. I then, after a few years, got into the business curriculum and I started taking business courses. I got an MBA and I started learning that I really should be contributing more to my 401k than I was putting in. But here's how you think when you're in your 20s. You think, well, I'm only making this small amount of money. I'll wait till I'm in my 40s when I'm making more money, or my 50s, and then I'll put more in. No, believe it or not, it's the small amounts you put in when you're in your 20s that have more time to grow.
Compound interest over
exactly,
time.
it has a greater number of years to compound because it's invested. So the small amounts you put in your 20s amount to more than larger amounts you put in when you're, say, 55 and retiring at 65. So,
very true.
Yeah.
So you should start as soon as possible then.
I
Is
do
it possible to start as a high school student even?
Oh, sure. Yeah, you could start as early as you want, and it'd be small amounts. But yeah, I do an example, and there are online calculators where you could estimate how much you end up with. But in today's dollars, even the lowest paid job at a bank teller position, if you were never promoted from that bank teller position and you retired from that bank teller position, I do this example where even the bank teller ends up with like $800,000 if that bank teller's putting 15% in over the course of a career. But people they're not aware of it, and they don't think about it maybe until they have a family and are paying other bills. Then it's maybe more difficult for them to make an adjustment,
Right.
or they're in their late 30s or 40s. But that's the thing to try to remember, 15%. If you can do that,
15%.
then you'll be in good shape.
How do you choose where to go for your 401k? This is through the banks?
Well, your employer will have a relationship with a financial services organization like Merrill Lynch or Prudential. These are companies that sell mutual funds to individuals, but also they manage retirement plans for employers.
Okay.
So Prudential is one, Merrill Lynch, Fidelity, and you will have a choice though. Like let's say it's Prudential. Let's say your employer's 401k plan is with Prudential. You'll have a choice of maybe 5 different plans at Prudential that have different levels of risk. You might be a very, very conservative person and you don't want as much in the stock market, and you have less in the stock market, more in the bond market.
Right.
That would be less return long term, but it might make you feel more comfortable. Or maybe you're more aggressive and you want 90% in the stock market, 10% in the bond market. You would have your choice, and you can even change those choices over time.
That's very good to know. So there's a lot of choices out there. Some research obviously is going to be needed to make sure you're picking the plan that's right for you. But to just have that conversation with your employer, I'm interested in this, where can we start?
Yep.
So you had wanted to talk about the public debt. What can you tell us
Yes.
about this?
Well, a lot of people are not aware of it or don't know what the implications of it is. Our public debt currently is $32 trillion. So
That's a large number.
yeah, a trillion is 1,000 billions. And our gross domestic product, let me just explain what that is. Our whole economy in a year produces some amount of goods and services. All the businesses that produce the goods and services, and then they get purchased. That is our gross domestic product, the dollar value of all those goods and services. And there's a whole process for measuring that. But that's a measure of how much we're producing in our economy. That, and I have some numbers here for you, in 2022, so the most recently completed year, 25.5 trillion was our gross domestic product. It's almost like similar to our gross domestic income too, the income of everybody that worked in the economy. Well, our public debt is more than that.
Right.
It's $32 trillion. It went up quite a bit during the pandemic because whenever the government is doing a stimulus program and spending more money than they're taking in taxes, they're adding to the public debt. So the way we got the public debt is each year our federal government puts together a fiscal plan for the year. In one column, it's all of their sources of revenue. Well, this is taxes, right? And then on the other column, it's all of their expenses. And most business organizations, revenues have to equal expenses.
Right.
Our federal government, every year, that's not the case. They can't, or they're unwilling to either cut their expenses or raise the taxes so that the two are equal?
Raising the tax is probably very controversial.
Well, it's politically unpopular.
Yes.
And these are politicians that have to get reelected.
Right.
Yeah. And and cutting government spending is also difficult because a lot of what government spends money on are entitlement programs. They can't do it there, can't cut Social Security.
Right.
Or other areas of the government that's providing jobs. So it's politically unpopular to do either, so they don't do either. Instead, they borrow money every single year.
From the same source or various sources?
The same source, and the source is they create treasury bonds. A treasury bond is the federal government borrowing money. They sell them on the bond market. People buy them as investments. And it's not individual people, it's institutional investors. Like if you have a 401k plan, some of what you own is treasury bonds.
Right.
It's banks, it's financial institutions, it's 401k plans, it's insurance companies buy them, foreigners buy them. About 30% of this outstanding debt is owned by foreigners, companies and individuals outside the United States. So each year we're creating new treasury bonds and selling them, but then we've got to pay them off.
Right.
Maybe like, let's say it's a 10-year bond, and it's a $10,000 bond. Well, after 10 years, the government's got to pay that bond off plus all of the interest.
Yes.
So how do they do that? Because 10 years from now, they're going to have a deficit budget then too.
Right.
The way they do it is they create a new treasury bond and sell that to pay off the retiring debt.
It's a never-ending cycle.
It is. And the only way to fix it is to have a budget surplus, or at least stop increasing the public debt by having a balanced budget. But at this point, it has grown to the point where it's $32 trillion. And so if you're probably wondering, how much do I owe?
Yes, I was going to ask,
There are
what is the public's responsibility towards this public debt?
Yeah, it's owned by all of the citizens of the United States, and there are 334 million people in the United States, so that's $96,000 each.
Is this why we pay taxes?
Yes, so some of what the federal government's budget have to be each year is the interest on this outstanding debt that's out there. But, okay, so what are the implications of this? Well, if we continue to borrow, then we might get to the point where investors don't want to buy these treasury bonds anymore. And we can't, as treasury bonds come due every 10 years, we can't create enough new treasury bonds that people want to buy to pay off the retiring treasury bonds. Now, if there's any positive to this, we are borrowing the money at very low interest rates. These treasury bonds, at least to this point, have been considered a very, very safe investment for anybody that buys them, because we have never defaulted on a treasury bond, our federal government. So we could sell them at very, very low interest rates, but maybe that starts to rise as our public debt becomes larger and larger. But the reason I wanted to bring this up is because there's no plan to fix this. Nobody has a good plan to pay off our public debt, even long term.
I think the only solution would be for whoever invested to just forgive it, and that's not likely. So
No. Now, 2/3 of, 70% of the public debt is owned by Americans.
yes,
And American
that's very
corporations.
surprising. The popular idea is that we owe everything to other countries, and that we
30% of it,
internally
right.
aren't responsible for this debt. It's all the other countries that we owe it to. So it's very eye-opening to hear that a lot of it actually is internal within our own self, and maybe there's some hope that we can fix that part of it at least, since it's within our own country. What do you think about that?
Well, the only way to do that is to raise taxes to pay off the debt. And as I said, since so many people are unaware of it, so many of the voters, nobody wants to make them aware of that and then propose this and not get reelected.
Maybe that's where we
So, I
can
mean-
start, though, just educating the public about it, and
I agree.
because we see terms all the time on the internet, like the debt ceiling, and the average person doesn't know what that is. But I think if politicians and the government were more transparent in telling us what's really going on, maybe as a nation we won't be as in the dark and as opposed to solutions, because we're a part of the conversation.
Right. I agree. I think everybody should be aware of it. And then maybe that's part of your decision making as you're electing someone to Congress.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Mr. Mrozinski. Do you have any parting advice to students who may be watching this as far as retirement, savings, investing? Just
Well-
a general start point for that.
Well, the 15% is a huge issue because so many people don't know about it and don't know to think about it. People that make a lot of money just didn't know, maybe until they were in their 40s, that this is what they should have been doing. And I always find a way to talk about this in every one of my business classes, and it's actually not in our curriculum, believe it or not. We do have a personal money management course that we teach, but it's not required in our business curriculum because it doesn't transfer to the four-year schools, so few people take it. But
Right.
that would be the course where you learn about all this. What is insurance? What is healthcare insurance? What is a retirement plan?
I think that needs to be extended to high school students too. I see
Right.
online the discussions amongst a lot of middle schoolers and high schoolers. They teach us all this stuff about math, nothing about accounting, how to do our taxes. So I think students as a whole would really enjoy learning about real world applications for how they can make sure economically and their finances are where they need to be. So maybe we can propose something to where it's transferable, get more students involved in the course, because I think the more that you're educated about these things, the better decisions you'll make about them.
That's true. If I could just mention one more thing that's related to this. Our savings rate in the United States is lower than other similar economically developed countries. We have a trade imbalance. On the whole, we import more than we export. And I have some numbers for you. Our net exports in 2022 were minus $945 billion. So let's round that up to 1 trillion. That means we're importing 1 trillion more than we export.
Yes.
So on the whole, what that means is we are consuming, and that's 3.7% of GDP of what we're producing. What that means is we're consuming 3% more than we produce in the United States. So how do you fix that? So there's a net flow of dollars out of our economy, out of our borders. So how do you fix that? Well, there's two ways to do that. And how can it be that countries like Germany and other Western European countries, which we consider to be similar to us, have trade surpluses?
Right.
They export more than they import. Well, there's two ways to fix it. You could either produce more. That's actually difficult to do because we have low unemployment and we're already a highly productive labor force. But that would be one way to do it, produce 3% more. How about if we spend 3% less?
Yes.
If we were buying 3% less of our GDP, then that's 3% that could be exported.
Right.
That's what's happening in countries like Germany. Their savings rate, on average, is 10% or higher, and other Western European countries. Our savings rate fluctuates between 5 and 7%.
Because just the general culture is to consume rather than to
That's exactly
save.
right. If we would save more of our income, then there would be all kinds of benefits to our economy and to each of us individually.
I would like to see more programs aimed to educating young people about that. So just get the general public in a different mind state on how they approach their economy rather than buying what they don't need and just spending and spending. How can we save and how can we all benefit from that type of lifestyle as a nation? So thank you very much, Mr. Mrozinski.
All right, thank you. This was fun. Again, I thank you for inviting me, and best of luck to
Hopefully we
both
can
of
have you again.
I would love that.
The more students come in, we can have more of a discussion with other students, and it would be very informative and very helpful.
All right, sounds great.
Thank you. Well, that is the end of this episode of Outside the Box, presented to you by theCUBE. I want to thank the LCCC Common Arts Department and a special thanks to Mr. Mrozinski for coming out and joining us today. Join us again next episode where we'll have the facts and the opinions right here on theCUBE. See you soon.